Thanks so much for listening to the Wild Health Podcast. Be sure to follow us on social at Wild Health MD and head over to wildhealth.com or wildhealth.com/premium to become a patient and experience precision medicine for yourself. All right, everybody. Super excited today to have Dan Dworkis on the podcast. Dan, how's it going?
Great, man. Thanks for having me.
It's going to be really, really fun. I'm just going to do your intro so I can look at your face while I'm doing it and hopefully embarrass you a little bit.
Perfect. Can't wait.
Dan's an MD, PhD, so automatically one of the more committed and smarter people than I was in medical school. Is the founder of the Emergency Mind Project, the chief medical officer at the Mission Critical Team Institute. He's a board-certified emergency physician. He's also an assistant professor of emergency medicine at the Keck School of Medicine of USC. Dan and I know each other because he performed his emergency medicine residency with Harvard Med School at the Harvard-affiliated emergency medicine residency at Massachusetts General Hospital and Brigham Health, which that's a mouthful. I usually just tell people I went to residency at Highland. That's a lot easier. And I was an attending physician back at HMS and Brigham at the time. Dan has an MD and PhD in molecular medicine from the Boston University School of Medicine. And maybe we'll get a chance to see if you ever get to use any of your molecular medicine PhD in your day-to-day life as adult
Sure.
Dan Dworkis, but we'll
As
see.
adult. Still waiting for that guy to show up.
Yeah, I join the club. Dan's also the author of The Emergency Mind, Wiring Your Brain for Performance Under Pressure, which I have to say is a really cool book for people who are either in medicine or not in medicine. So would highly recommend to folks. And I don't know, no financial disclaimers. I don't get any kickbacks for people reading your book. I just think it's a great book.
Thanks.
So all that said, you gave me a whole host of things that we could talk about today, but the one that resonated where I thought we could really kind of dive deep and share some of your wisdom with listeners is on building mental tools to handle stress and pressure on the job. I think this is something that everybody with a job can relate to. And I'm going to really kind of feed you some softballs just to get your perspectives and your insights here. So why don't we just start off with, like, what are some common sources of stress in the workplace? And, where do people come to you? And maybe give us a little bit of background at the same time and sort of the work that you're doing in this space and sort of what your expertise draws from.
Sure. So I split time, right? So I do two main things, one of which is that I'm an emergency physician and I train other doctors to become emergency physicians. I'm doing the role that you were doing when we first met. And I have a very vivid memory of the first shift that we worked together, by the way. I remember the patient. I remember like my thought process. And I was so excited that I had figured out this link between these two things. And I can tell now that you were trying so hard to like allow me my space for excitement, but clearly knew the answer was something very different than what I had come up with. But it's still a great memory. So thank you for that. But so I spend my time seeing patients and training the next generation of doctors. And then in my other hat, or in my other half of time, is working with a variety of groups about performance under pressure. And that pressure ranges from, must not fail events in the sense of winning or losing, right? So I'll work with folks like a rugby team or a particular, corporation or organization where success or failure means a project lives or dies. Or I'll work with folks in the special forces community or in the medical community where the pressure is similar structure, but a very different caliber, right? And success or failure means life or death of a person or people. And, in all of those cases, in all of those realms, performance is pretty uniformly or universally impacted by pressure and stress, right? It doesn't matter what you're doing, like the ability to buffer stress and pressure and to deliver the skill set that you have under the conditions you need it to be delivered in is an incredible meta skill. And so in terms of what types of stuff we're dealing with that, like why do people feel stress and pressure? There's a bunch of different directions to take that. I think probably one of the most common is a supply-demand mismatch of resources, right? We want to deliver a certain thing. We know how to deliver a thing, but the amount of demand on our mind is so high for one reason or another. And you can drift a little bit in a cognitive load theory, which I'm happy to do, or we can sort of skim past that and head more into the realm of just the idea that like there's stuff that weighs on us, right? And that stuff might be directly related to what we're doing, or it could be outside of what we're doing. An unrelated second project happening at the same time, a total stressful situation at home that's taking part of our attention in a different direction than the work that we're trying to do, or something like that. And so we're faced with a situation where we're not necessarily bringing all of our skill set to bear at this moment because it's divided for one reason or another. We could have pressure because we are really worried about the outcome, because the impact is potentially life or death, and we have some feelings about what that might be, what that might involve, right? And then another really crucial one is actually a sense of identity, right? Often we have tied our sense of self to success or failure at a certain thing, right? And this drifts a little bit into sort of the fixed mindset versus growth mindset kind of an idea. But often, if we're approaching a problem set from a fixed mindset, we have tied our success to our vision of ourself, and that creates this enormous feedback, pressure, and stress loop where we're almost scared to not succeed at it because, wow, what does that mean about who I am? So there's a lot. There's a lot of cards we have to play against, a lot of things we have to overcome in order to really deliver our skill set.
Well, I mean, it's fascinating to me that the folks who generally gravitate into these high stress, high performance kind of situations, I'm thinking, medicine, special forces, C-suite at large corporations, the amount of drive and perfectionism and control that often goes along with the personalities that gravitate towards those sorts of things are pretty much inextricably linked to a strong identity and a really sort of identity threatening fear of failure in some of those situations. Is that how do you work with someone where you feel like their identity is really linked to their success in whatever particular stressful thing they're facing in their job?
Yeah, I think that is so fascinating, and to me, you've sort of zeroed in immediately on what I think is one of the most interesting pieces of all of this. So how does this relate to us as people and our senses of self and how we see ourselves in the universe? What we think our purpose is. I just earlier had a very awesome conversation where I was recording a podcast. My guest was an absolute top level hospitalist at Hopkins, and she was talking about how perfection is sometimes a blessing and sometimes a hindrance to her doing her work, the quest for perfection, right? Because perfection can drive us towards elite performance, but it can also drive us pretty far away from it when we're overburdened with the idea that everything has to be exactly a particular way. And so I think that is asking yourself that question of like, is perfection my friend or enemy in this moment? Is the quest for perfection my friend or my enemy right now? It's a really important question to ask, kind of an underused one, especially as you drift higher up, right? Because most of the time you get to where you're going by seeking perfection. And then at somewhere along the way, it suddenly stops becoming your friend in a lot of cases, especially in these high pressure emergency situations. But to answer a little more directly your question, when you think about identity, and when you've tied it to success or failure at a thing, there can be some pretty serious repercussions to that, right? And one of the things we think about a lot of times is the difference between performance and outcome. Okay, so performance, I'll borrow some of this from Annie Duke, who's an incredible author and an expert in decision making. Suggests setting up a 2x2 table of good performance, bad performance, good outcome, bad outcome. And when you're going through the exercise of seeing what happened in a particular event, she described that as fielding. You field what happened onto this 2x2 matrix. The idea is performance is what you control, right? Did you do everything in your power to do a good job or not? Did you perform at the top of your skill set given the environment you're playing in? Performance, yes or no. Outcome is what actually happened. Did the team succeed or fail at the mission? Did the merger go through or not? Did whatever it is that you're looking at? And the truth is that we have control largely over performance. We do not largely control outcome. That's particularly obvious to those of us that work in the emergency department, because I don't have the final say over whether or not somebody lives or dies, right? I can control my performance. I can help my team control their performance, but I don't get to pick who lives or dies at the end of the day. And if I tied my identity to who lives or dies, I'm vulnerable to all sorts of things happening. I mistake times when, my team did their absolute best and the person died anyway. I see that as my fault. I catastrophize that. And at times when I did a just absolute garbage job and by sheer luck the person had a great recovery, I'm vulnerable to sensing that as a success on my part. There's just all sorts of things that happen in there. So I think being really clear with yourself in terms of identity, like what is it that you control and are you looking at the right piece of that, is a great start for that.
I love that framework. I mean, to me, I see that as a way of kindly approaching the concept of the lack of free will
Mm,
and control. That I'm not going to spin us down a free will conversation in depth, but I think there is a case to be made that we have no control over anything that's happening in
mm.
our lives, and but I think that can spin nihilistic and kind of Debbie
Yeah.
Downerish, and I think there is a healthy way to look at, am I bringing the agency that I do have, whatever that may be, even if it's just this minuscule
Mm-hmm.
piece, and bringing my best to the situation, and then not attaching or attaching any measure of self-criticism or self-celebration to the effort that you put in and to the skills that you brought to the table, as opposed to what actually happened. I think that's significantly more healthy. Maybe not full bar healthy of not even worrying about whether you brought all of your skills to the table, because maybe that's beyond your control too. Maybe there is something going on at home
Mm-hmm.
that's distracting you from being able to bring all your skills to the table, or maybe there's competing interests or something else beyond your control. But I think it's definitely a kinder way of looking at performance, as opposed to looking at outcome.
Yeah. I'm there's two things that come to mind at that. One is, it's a quote. I forget if it's from Epictetus or Seneca, one of the Stoic philosophers, that says, basically like if your ship is going down and the only thing left for you to do is drown, then you should try to drown fearlessly. And there's a link in there somewhere to Man's Search for Meaning by Frankl, where he talks in his treatise on logotherapy about the idea of like, if you can eliminate suffering, eliminate it. But if you can't eliminate the suffering, try to suffer nobly, because that's your choice as a human being. And I think that is within our control over there. But we're like going off the map into philosophy here pretty quickly on that.
Well, you know that we're in danger of doing that whenever we get on the phone
Yeah,
together. So
absolutely.
this is this is not a terrible surprise. I'll steer the ship. The ship's not
Great.
going down. We don't need to drown nobly. We're gonna turn this around. Although I will just say, Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning has got to be like one of my top 5 recommended reads for
Yeah,
all humans.
absolutely incredible.
So if you haven't read that, that's a must read. All right. So I said I was going to feed you softballs, but obviously I'm going to
Instead, we got
like
into
feed
death.
you at least
Excellent.
one
Yeah.
one curveball. So when I think of tools and strategies, mental tools and strategies to handle stress and pressure on the job. I think about what I do. I think about what
Uh-huh.
I counsel patients to do and counsel, friends and colleagues and family to do. And I think of it as all somewhat sort of low hanging fruit, because it's well established to be beneficial. Most of it is, extremely low risk, and, the rewards can just be phenomenal.
Mm-hmm.
So if I went to you to coach me on handling stress and pressure on the job, and you told me, you should really develop a contemplative practice of some kind, whether it's, sitting meditation, walking
Uh-huh.
meditation, yoga, etc. You should get out into nature. You should disconnect from your electronics more regularly. You should get really good sleep. You should have good community and have a good network of people to speak with and to lean on
Sure.
when things are tough. I would say all of those sound phenomenal, and yes, I'm fully on board. But give me something that I don't already know, Dan. Like, what else should
Yeah.
I be doing?
So there's a layer where you're talking about tactics and strategy. And then to me, there's a deeper layer that has to come first before that. Right. So before we even get into like, are you doing the, you know, the things that you could you could somewhat pejoratively call hacks, right? Like before you're doing all those like things, right? What is the why? Why are you doing this job in the first place? What's the purpose? What's your underlying mission? What's your reason for being that gets you up and does that thing, right? So when I think about that for me for emergency medicine, um, like we said, I don't always get to choose whether or not I can save or fix the person in front of me. That's not something that's necessarily in my control. And so to wrestle with that and to come with a reason of why I do this, why do you put yourself on an edge of things where there's like chaos and blood and sometimes people throw punches at you and they yell at you and all sorts of crazy stuff happens and you're exposed to so much human suffering. Like why do you keep doing that, right? And to me, part of the answer is that I pledge to my patients, whoever comes in front of me, that I'm going to learn from them and be better tomorrow than I am today, right? That I'm not going to waste their suffering. I'm not going to waste my suffering either. In fact, if you made me boil it down, I would just say, never waste suffering. And that's the underlying why, the core value that powers so much of what it is that I do, right? So what that means is that whatever somebody comes in front of me, I'm going to learn from them, whether it was a good outcome or bad outcome or whatever happens. And I know that tomorrow, if I see that same case, I'm going to be better at it. I'll be better able to take care of their kids than I am able to take care of them. And that's actually like gets back into the whole, like, why do you do a PhD and why do you do all that other stuff, right? Because you want to learn how to get better at what you're doing, not just to do the same thing over and over again. But with that why comes an absolute like excellent variety of tactics and structures and sort of the how that comes on top of that. But if you don't have that burning why, all of the little details about like, breathe in this pattern or like practice meditation, like they're not really going to answer the underlying question for you. So that's my biggest piece is find that why, find that underlying driving forcing function that you commit to, that you want to keep doing. Um, a second piece of it, other than pledging to the people in front of you, comes from the Maori culture, right? And I think it's pronounced whakapapa. It's the idea that we are part of an unbroken chain of all of the people that have come before us, right? It's the culture and the ancestors that come before us. And we think about all of the other humans that have had to go through crazy pieces of existence and pushed and pulled and sacrificed and gotten us to the point where we are, right? It's the standing on shoulders of giants idea, right? And I recognize that part of my job, as long as I'm alive, is to move that chain a little bit farther forward, right? To complete that next step for whoever comes after me. There's some like, cool reverberations in having that conversation with you who taught me how to do part of what I do, right? And now I'm sitting here thinking about teaching the next generation of folks to do their stuff. But those two whys, right? Like to connect to the deeper meaning of what humanity is and to not waste suffering, and that will drive you in a lot of different directions that is deeper than the sort of ripples on the top.
Yeah. So, one of the fundamental principles of Western medicine and Eastern medicine for that matter is treating the underlying cause of whatever the illness may be. Right. So, if my heart rate's
Yeah,
160 and you decide to give me a medication to slow my heart rate down, but it's 160 because I've got a thyroid storm, that's not
sure.
really necessarily going to help me. Or maybe because I'm dehydrated or infected, that's a better
Right.
example. You want to be treating the dehydration or the infection as opposed to the heart rate.
Uh-huh.
And I think,
Yeah.
you know, if you can really guide someone towards identifying and investigating the why, by all means, the whether they choose to do some breath work or some meditation on
Yeah,
top of
exactly.
that, it probably less
Yeah.
important. I'm curious. I know you do a lot of work in this field. You do a lot of consulting for folks. How often or how unusual is it for you to work with someone where the why is really the core issue, that there's a real disconnect between what folks are doing in their job versus what they're really feeling internally?
That's a good question. I sometimes the link is more tenuous than others, right? I think people understand that people got into what they're doing for a particular reason, and they're staying with it, and they're pushing themselves forward because they want to get better at it. But the link between that and the underlying thing is sometimes cloudy or sometimes murky, especially when there's a big gap between, I guess I'd call it like what you're doing and where you have control, right? So if you're working in a really rigid hierarchical structure, and you're told you got to make this widget like this, and the gap between that widget and what you're trying to accomplish is really large, it can drift, right? There can be a whole sort of series of fences or clouds or whatever between you and what you're aiming at. Um, that also honestly varies, in time, space, and reality, right? Like we're, humans are these like fun mix of, you have all these noble ideals and sort of like underlying structure of what you want to do with your life. And you're also a bag of chemicals that, depending on how you modulate that bag of chemicals, maybe you're tired and the link just feels a lot different, right? It's fuzzier because you're not feeding yourself the right way. And, and I think you and I have had these great discussions about like how, everything feels different after a night shift because you just have not put your neurochemistry in the right order that it takes to actually accomplish anything. And, that I think that it's sort of a circular answer to your question about what else would I do that's not on that list is like, get my neurochemistry in order, like whatever it takes for me to do that. And also recognize when my neurochemistry is out of order, because sometimes it just feels like there's a big gap between your why and what you're doing.
Well, I thought for a second we were going down space time is doomed, and I was like, we're just going to go completely. The ship is definitely going down right now.
Drown fearlessly, man. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, when there's no space time, it's really easy to drown fearlessly. Let me just tell you. All right. So, other takeaways. If we wanted to move, let's pivot a little bit to some practical things that folks could apply like today after listening to us.
Yeah, absolutely.
Chat back and forth on mental tools for handling stress and pressure at work. I mean, I took away some of the low hanging fruit about just getting your general stress resiliency in order. But what about sort of, work specific things that you'd like to chat with people about and counsel people on?
Yeah, I think the question is what connects you to that underlying why, right? How do you remind yourself of that purpose during, before and after your work? And how do you judge what you're doing based on your reflection to that underlying purpose? Mass General has this really long brick-lined hallway that leads into one of the doors of the ER, right? And I would always walk down that hallway, even if that meant going like the long way around everything before I walked into the ER so I could go through this hallway. And I did that because I used that time and that physical change of location in that one hallway to set myself up to connect to my why. Right. So every time I walked down that hallway, I would personally think about one of the lines from the Hippocratic Oath, which is, into whatever house you enter, may it be for the good of the people within. And I was like, okay, I can't control everything. I can't fix everything. I'm just me. But I know when I walk through those doors, it's going to be for the good of every human inside those doors. And that's my commitment. And that's how I'm going to judge myself at the end of the day. Did I do that or not? So I would set it up so every time I went in, I had this like touchstone, this physical space of crossing a boundary that allowed me to gear up for what I was about to do. And when I left, I would go through that same door. I'd walk through that same hallway, and I'd imagine sort of like taking off the pieces of armor and sort of doing the stuff that it has to take in order to re-enter back into my normal life. If you do have a job that allows you to create some mental signposts like that, right? Really what we're talking about is ritual, right? Can you create a ritual that allows you to connect to your deeper why as you're doing your work? Can you find ways in the middle of your work to reconnect you to that also, right? Maybe that's like planting a suggestion in your mind. Okay, when I see this one thing, I'm going to remember to think about this mantra that I like, or I'm going to remember to take a couple deep breaths. And this is my anchor moment. This is my pivot point for it. I actually got in trouble a few times at Brigham. I don't think ever when you and I were working together, because I would post these little signs all over, especially in Charlie Pod, which I don't think Charlie Pod exists anymore, but I had these signs up, and then they would come and take them down and they'd put them back up again. And I got a couple very stern talking to from some mutual friends of ours who were like, you can't do that. I was like, no, I'm reconnecting to my why. These are my mental, anchors. And Sometimes you can't do
the
that all the time.
the Y committee had not approved your signs
The
apparently,
Y
so they
committee had
couldn't
not
they
improved my
couldn't go
signs.
out.
Yes.
But I got to tell you,
Yes.
I had a very different ritual for about
Hmm.
10 years. The in before when I was still working in the emergency department, before I would go into a shift, and I always found the biggest sort of cognitive dissonance and challenge for me at work after several years of practicing emergency medicine wasn't, do I know how to take care of this type of patient with this type of problem, or do I know how to
Hmm.
manage the nuances of waking up a neurosurgeon at 2 a.m. because it actually really is important and they need to come into the hospital, and like all that stuff was kind of old hat, frankly. But where I found myself struggling was with empathy drain,
Uh,
and with just really wanting to be there and to connect with patients while faced with that significant supply demand challenge of,
sure.
you think about a night shift in the emergency department, there's one physician, there's 20 people in the waiting room, there's multiple people unseen, and lots of people need your time.
Hmm.
And being able to maintain that empathy even in times where it felt like there was very little left to give. And mine was not nearly as eloquent or noble as yours, and I'll paraphrase it so that we don't have to bleep the podcast. But I would get out of my car and I would close the door and I would lock my car and I would say out loud to myself, again, I'm paraphrasing, don't be a jerk.
Hmm. Sure.
And that was the beginning of every shift. And it was what I would try and hold on to through the entire shift. Is the one thing I that I don't need to bring, but that is important to me to bring to this environment and to these interactions, is kindness. And I can, I can't stop myself from bringing my medical knowledge. Like, that's there and that's what people sign up for and they deserve to get that. But they also deserve to get kindness, and it's something that's often missing in a healthcare encounter. So that was that just you reminded me of my pre-shift ritual,
Yeah.
so I appreciate that.
Absolutely. So, okay. So if you were my coaching client, right? If you were working with the Emergency Mind Project and we're thinking about how to sort of upgrade some of this stuff and nudge you in different directions, there's a couple of things I would key off of that, right? First, good stuff. You have a habit and it's tied to a physical thing that has to happen every time. You say this in your head when you close the car door and lock it. That's awesome, right? If you have a sticky anchor for a habit, that's a great way to start moving from it. Okay. And you also have an established habit, which is that you found yourself doing this thing multiple times, right? If you read a lot of the literature on habit building, habit stacking is a really important thing. So
Mm-hmm.
habit stacking is you have an existing habit. Now we're, instead of changing that or getting rid of it or whatever, we're going to add a layer on top of it that's going to change the things a little bit. We're going to use the hook that it already has in us, which is a very sort of cross between, like, Buddhism and judo, right? Using the using the hook, like, to move yourself in the right direction, and we're going to add layers on top of that. So then what I would do is say, all right, so right now you're saying don't be a jerk. How is that working for you? Is that doing positive things? Is it eliminating the stress, or is it just sort of a reflection of the underlying turmoil that you're feeling, right?
Oh, I love
And
it. Let's jump in.
yeah, right. So what we might say is, well, what else could you do there? Right? Are there other things or other ways that you could approach that problem that would be more productive or nudge you more in the direction that you want to go in than don't be a jerk? Maybe there aren't. Maybe don't be a jerk is the absolute optimum thing that Mike Stone can say before he wanders into the shift.
Yeah, I mean, it's amazing to think about, because I definitely went through this process of
Mm-hmm.
what's the core thing that I'm really reminding myself of.
Yeah.
Why am I telling myself this? What role is it playing? What function does it serve? And it was basically a cognitive and emotional lamppost to say, all right, you're here, let
Mm-hmm.
go of all the other stuff that's going on, whatever, wherever else your mind is. What's the most important thing that you want to bring to your interactions with your patients? It's compassion and empathy, and all the other stuff will follow from there. And I toyed
Mm-hmm.
with lots of positive affirmations
Sure.
and lots of ways of reframing that, and ultimately I just fell back on being a guy from New Jersey who likes to speak bluntly.
Yeah, totally.
And I was like, yeah, I'm going to stick with that one. And it worked really well for me. But I think it's a really cool process to go, hey, okay, you have this habit and it's helpful to you, but helpful in what way? Is it alleviating
Mm-hmm.
stress? Is it making you feel more calm before you enter? Is it allowing you to touch back into your why more regularly? And there's so many levels to really kind of probe and explore there.
Yeah. There's there's a book uh, by these folks out of Boston, and the title of the book is Another Bullshit Night in Suck City. And it's an incredible title of a book. And sometimes that's what it feels like when you're getting into the work that you're doing, right? That's just like, that's what you're facing. And it's easy to have that feeling well up and to say that, and to that be the thing that you hold on to, right? That's your life preserver almost, right? Like things are so crazy and so stressful. And what feels like it's holding you up is just you saying this thing about how bad it is. And there's no, I'm not here to pass judgment and be like, you got to say it positive, you got to say it negative. Like,
Sure.
I don't know, man, do whatever you're going to do, right? But you got to at least ask yourself the question, is this thing I'm doing helping me?
Mm-hmm.
Or is it just a reflection of the underlying stress and pressure that I'm feeling? And it's more like a cry for help than it is like an actual like ramp up ritual.
Yeah,
Um,
for sure. For sure. Well, I mean, it's sort of a, I definitely see the distinction between, reciting part of the Hippocratic Oath to yourself as you walk into the emergency department versus saying time to make the donuts for all those East Coasters out there. There's
Maybe, right? Yeah.
I don't think that allowed the Dunkin' Donuts guy to like connect with his deep why to when the alarm went off and and it was time to make the donuts, but maybe it did.
Khalil Gibran in his book The Prophet says, if you're a baker, donut maker, and you make bread with indifference, you create a loaf that only feeds half of man's hunger. Right. So like maybe honestly that's what it was. Maybe this person, maybe this Dunkin' Donuts wizard loves, feeding people, and like this is the why for it. That's awesome. Right. But like, are you doing it on purpose? Right?
Mm-hmm.
Are you doing the thing for it? And I don't think you have to like so many times I said that Hippocratic Oath, that was the only thing that held me together. Right. Because I was like terrified walking into a shift when knew I was going to be overwhelmed, and I was a totally crushed resident and things were just like not working. And that was my lifeline as I was moving forward into it. And it's okay. It's okay that it feels like that sometimes. It's okay that sometimes you say other things. It's okay that sometimes it feels negative. Like the question is, are you are you moving in the right direction? Are you making progress? Are you trying to connect with your why? And are you trying to open up yourself to the possibility that you could be doing better than you are right now? Right. So there's this great system that Jim Collins uses, right? The author of Good to Great and all sorts of other amazing books like that, where basically at the end of every day, he assigns every day a score, and it's between -2 and 2. And that's it. A 2 day is an absolute off the charts amazing. A -2 is like the worst day that you come up with. And most days are somewhere in the middle. Right. And then over time, he goes back and he looks and he goes, all right, what are the things that happen when I hit twos? What does that teach me about what's going on in my life? Am I doing those things more? Am I pointing myself more towards the things that are likely to give me twos than -2s?
I love it. It's
Yeah.
such an awesomely arbitrary scale too, right?
Oh, it's great.
Yeah.
Yeah.
How often do you ask somebody on a scale of -2 to 2?
I mean, it's technically a 5-point Likert scale, right?
Yeah,
But
yeah. I
who knows?
guess. I
Yeah.
guess you're much more qualified to answer whether -2 to 2 actually counts as a 5-point Likert scale than I am. But
Whatever, man.
I'll
Yeah.
defer to the PhD on the podcast. Um, so I love that, we obviously, like, I love hearing personal stories. I think everyone
Mhm.
does. Other things besides your long brick lined walk to the MGHER that you'd like to share in terms of things that have worked well for you, or strategies you've explored around managing stress and pressure on the job.
You know, especially when you are starting to lead, right? When you're starting to lead teams, the idea of how you're able to show stress and pressure and experience stress and pressure changes a little bit, because you're not just beholden to yourself anymore. You're actually also, you need to keep the team together and you need to lead the space. And so, where there might be times otherwise where you just have the ability to go off and sort of deal with what happened, as a leader, you have to look first to your people. And so that creates this sort of dissonance where you have to hold on to stuff for a little bit before you're able to process it. And I think um, knowing that and leaning into that rather than away from it is an important piece of this. So, and this makes a little more sense here if you're leading a team, but even if you're not, this still makes sense, which is asking the question, like, what do I have the space for right now? Okay. And the answer might be that you deal with what happens when there's stress in a couple of waves. And the first wave is just, am I safe right now? Right? Did something happen that is unsafe either for me or for my team? Right? In the ER, that might be like, wow, we just had a total chaos of resuscitation, and the fiber optic whatever scope is broken, and so we're unable to do this thing. Okay, so we're actually sort of not safe because we do need that tool sometimes. The most important thing that we can do to handle the stress of this moment is to go fix that tool so we're safe again. It's a little counterintuitive, right? Because you talk about psychological safety, you talk about like handling stress. Most of the time we're talking about like, breathing exercises and nutrition and sleep. We're not talking about fixing the fiber optic bronchoscope. But really in that moment, we have to get from unsafe to safe. We have to protect ourselves and our team. And that's the first wave. And so that is, self-care and handling stress and psychological safety and everything else is just recovering to safe again. All right. So then you're safe. And then you can start doing some of the processing stuff for it. And some of that processing stuff about stress and pressure comes in, finding, like, really doing a dig about what happened and actually focusing like both on the signals, the emotional signals about what I'm feeling about what happened, but also getting a good view of like, what do we think actually happened? And when you are part of a team, there's some real magic that happens when you're able to ask different people without judgment, just to tell their version of the story of what went down. Right? Because you see all of a sudden, wow, there's all these different viewpoints about what actually happened, and they're a little different than mine. And well, maybe I don't really have the whole picture about what's going on. And a lot of stuff happens just from that, just as like a baseline. And so I think there's so many times when that has changed what happens after a case in the ER or changed what I do about it. But I get, my real piece of advice here is to do this in waves, to get from wherever you are to safe, then to start digging into a little bit about what happened, and then to start processing what you're feeling about it. Don't try to do the whole thing in one bite. There's no point, and you're probably going to choke on it.
Yeah, I mean, I want to dig a little bit into that from
Yeah.
the emergency medicine side of things, and really just from the medicine side of things. Although, as I'm saying that, like military, first responder,
Mm-hmm.
there's all sorts of different fields of work where this question would come up for me, which is, um, you're often in a situation where you're witnessing something terrible. It's
Uh-huh.
just objectively terrible. It's somebody suffering terribly, or it's a tragic outcome for a young person, or it's something just that's really
For
heartbreaking.
sure.
And yet the demands of the job dictate that you're going to go see the next person who needs to be seen, or you're going to go on the next ambulance call, or the next 911
Mm-hmm.
response, or whatever situation you're in. In that sort of situation, certainly processing and recovering from that experience in waves makes a lot of sense, because you literally can't
Mm-hmm.
just not go back to work. There are other people who depend on you going back to work. Um, what advice do you have for folks about making sure that they actually get back to it in a subsequent wave? Because
Mm-hmm.
I can say that I think there's a significant under recognized uh, unprocessed trauma burden in people who've been working in those fields, right? I mean, I think we have over the last 20, 30 years really come to recognize that, yes, veterans have a lot of unprocessed trauma, that
Mm-hmm.
post-traumatic stress disorder is very common, much more common than it was previously thought to be. Lots of interesting therapeutic pathways and strategies around it. But I don't see much about that even now in the sort of medical field. Think about what our healthcare workers had to deal with over the last 3 years, even.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, not even prior, even let's forget about prior to the pandemic, although it was certainly just as
Sure.
traumatic and stressful. So, what do you think? how do you approach making sure that people get back to processing the events if they're doing it in waves? Like, how many waves is good? I know there's not an answer for that, but timing between, like,
Yeah.
is there sort of a statute of limitations where if you let it go for too long, it's just going to come up 25 years later for you? And sort of how do you think
Yeah.
about that?
One of the concepts we talk a lot about in the Mission Critical Team Institute is the idea of residue, right? And residue is the stuff left over when you go through an emotionally charged experience. And that's a good emotionally charged experience, right? That's like the residue that comes with, meeting a new child for the first time, or attending a wedding ceremony for close friends and family, watching somebody, make it through cancer, right? It's also the residue that happens when you're through a terrible emotionally charged experience, right? The death of a child, a case that's totally horrific, the loss of a teammate or something. And residue is not a bad thing. It is the natural course of events of being human, right? Having residue does not mean you're broken. It doesn't mean you're weak, and it doesn't mean there's something wrong with you. It's just the natural course of being human. We go through these incredibly intense experiences, and it leaves residue on us. But if you don't process residue, right? If you don't do anything with the residue, like any sort of residue or gunk, it really jams up your works, and it's going to make bad things happen, nebulously. But you also have the choice about processing it. And if you process the residue, good or bad, that caused it, it's what allows you to become a better version of yourself in the future, right? If you think back and you talk to folks that have been through hard things and they've processed it and they've worked with it, they've come to grips with that residue, they'll tell you, I wouldn't trade that for anything.
Mm-hmm.
It was harder than anything I've ever done in my life, but it's one of the core pillars of what made me who I am. And that's what allows me to do this other stuff. Right. So I think one of the first answers is recognizing that residue is natural. Having it doesn't mean you're a bad person or weak, but you have to learn how to process it. It's a skill. If you don't think about it, if you don't do anything, the default pattern is it'll probably screw you up, all things being equal. So what do
Yeah.
you do about it? How do you start processing it? And first is you start talking about it with other people. Now, that could be other people that do the same thing that you do, or there's a lot of benefit that comes from talking to people that do things that are sort of like analogous, but not exactly what you do, right? So talking with, if you're an emergency doctor, talking with folks in the special forces community. If you're in the special forces community, talking with somebody who's in, an F1 racer or something, right? Like people that do hard things, but that are a little bit different than you, that don't really understand, that are just next to you. There is magic that happens in that if you can get a hold of those folks. That's not the easiest thing to do, and in fact, most people in those roles don't have access to other people in those sort of sister roles. But if you do, that's a great place to start. Otherwise, talking to other folks that do understand about what you're doing is an incredibly important piece of it. And the more we're able to arm ourselves with this structure and terminology, the easier it is for me to come to you and say, Mike, I've got this residue I'm working on. Oh, okay, cool. You know exactly what I'm talking about. We both know that we sign up for hard things. Our answer isn't going to be don't do hard things, right? Our answer isn't going to be you're broken for having seen this. Our answer isn't going to be you're a weak human for feeling this thing. No, we know what we're talking about. We know what residue is about. It's also not going to be some of the nonsense that you hear from other folks, right? What did I hear recently? Like, if you're feeling overwhelmed, just walk outside for 15 or 20 minutes until you cool down. And I'm like, yo, my patient's dead. I can't leave for 15 or 20 minutes. It's not safe, right? Or my other favorite one recently was go touch some furniture. I'm like mystified by that, but this was like
Does it have to be fuzzy furniture?
yeah, I don't know. I won't get into who they are or where I heard this because it's a little ridiculous, but that was the official line was go find some furniture to touch. And I'm like, there is nothing in the ER that you want to touch.
No.
Nothing. Right? Like there's nothing you want to touch in the ER. Even if there was furniture, which there isn't, you don't want to touch it. Right. So there's just like that illogical sort of like misapplication of average stuff to not average stuff is hard. But if we don't do that, if instead we start from what the founder of the what the founder of the Mission Critical Institute, Preston Klein, would call the extraordinary world, right? All these people that are doing this really hard stuff. You start from that space and you say, okay, residue is real. All right, you know it, I know it. Cool, I'm going to talk to you about it. Hey, I got residue. Can we work through this a little bit? And then you just start talking a little bit. It doesn't have to be an answer. It doesn't have to be an anything. But you asked me about processing this in waves, and I went on a little bit of a tangent, which is to get us back to this point, which is to say that the first step is getting safe. The second step is recognizing that you have residue. And then you start digging into it a little bit. And it's going to look a little different for every person, right? It's going to look a little different, but getting times on the map, on the calendar where you can dig back and forth about it, I think is crucially important. So there are certain people that I have that on a regular basis, I'll check in with them and say, hey, this is what I'm working on. Here's the residue. Here's what's up. Here's what I'm doing about it. And then there are also certain situations that I'll find myself in when I reflexively do that, going back to that idea of a physical anchor to change the way that you're behaving. So for me, one of them is hiking, right? Anytime I'm hiking, when I get to the point where it feels really hard, that's a reminder to me to think about all of the patients I've had recently that aren't able to make it out of the hospital, that'll never get their heart rate up like this again, and that won't be able to do this hike. And often at the top, I'll pause for a minute and think about those people for a minute and be like, all right, like this is a chance for me to open up into that space and to really dig into it a little bit. Because I know I've just done something that reminds me that that's not a thing that they're able to do anymore. That combo of stuff, people and places like that in layers tends to work pretty well for it. Although I'll also answer that this is a work in progress for me. Right? Like I'm still figuring out how to process residue. Professional therapy is also incredibly helpful, and I highly, highly recommend it. But creating this layered system around you that allows you to have triggers to think about it is probably really important.
Wow, Dan, I feel like we could easily make this into the personal record podcast of 3 or 4 hours, because there's like 1,000 other things I want to dive into. But I'm gonna wind us down, and then I'm gonna once I hit stop on this recording, I'm gonna start begging you now for a repeat visit. We'll
let's
from
do
there.
it.
How do people find out more about you, get in contact with you, learn about the work you're doing a little bit more deeply, other than reading your book, which we'll put a link into the show notes for sure?
Absolutely. Yeah. Easiest place to find me is emergencymind.com, or you can reach me directly at dan@emergencymind.com.
Awesome. Listen, thank you so much. Super fun conversation as always, and I'm already looking forward to the next one.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
All right. Thanks so much for listening to the Wild Health Podcast. If you want more daily health education, be sure to follow us on Instagram, which is filled with health optimization how-tos, grocery shopping lists, guided breathwork posts, myth debunking, and so much more. You can find us at Wild Health MD on Instagram.